everyone, it's Melissa, and today I am doing my wrap up for June. I only have 3 books to talk about. I thought I would have a fourth. I was supposed to read Orcs and Crake by Margaret Atwood as part of the booktube spin. I was supposed to finish that in June, but I'm about halfway through it right now, and I don't want to speed read the last of it just to get it on this wrap up, and I don't want to post my wrap up super late just to include it. So that will go on the July's wrap up. So I have 3 other things to talk about. So the first book I want to talk about is Leviathan Wakes by James S.A. Corey. So this is the first in the Expanse series. And overall, I liked this. I would give it about a 3 or 3.5 stars. I enjoyed it. I don't think it was anything amazing. This is a science fiction book. It's a space opera. It doesn't focus too heavily on technology or anything like that. It's more about the story of these characters and kind of the problem they have to solve. It is set in a future where we have colonized Mars and have set up some smaller colonies or stations on larger asteroids in the belt. The world is or this universe is kind of divided between the inner planets, so Earth and Mars, and the moon and the people who live there, versus belters, so people who were born and grew up in the belt, and the moons and dwarf planets kind of surrounding the outer limits of where humanity has reached. We follow, it changes perspective chapter to chapter. We follow a detective named Miller and a ship captain named Holden. So a ship is destroyed, and that's kind of Captain Holden's narrative, where a ship he had been on is destroyed, and he and his crew have to seek safety in another vessel. That's the starting point of his story. So Miller is a belter, and he is a detective on this dwarf planet, and his story gets started where there are some riots starting to happen in the belt, specifically on the station where he's located, and he gets assigned this case of a missing woman, and so his story of trying to track down what happened to this missing woman, and Holden's story of watching the ship he had been on be destroyed, and trying to escape this, whatever threat it is. They don't know who has destroyed the ship or why. Their stories slowly intersect, and these things end up being related, but we don't know how. And there's kind of a mystery or kind of conspiracy element to the story. So this book is very, I would say, political. There's a lot of tension between people who live on the inner planets versus people who live in the belt. I did like the story. I thought it was interesting. There are some horror elements, which of course appealed to me. I loved the space travel element and the colonies and how that was set up and how humans have changed. So people who were born and grew up on the belt in low gravity, their bodies are different. I kind of thought the implication of the fractioning of human into these different regions, I found that all very intriguing. I like how there were some mild differences in language. There were derogatory terms like earther and belter, and different dialects, and hand gestures, and just different cultural differences between the areas where humanity has colonized. So I found all of that very interesting. And although I did find the mystery elements interesting and the story interesting overall, I think it did become a little convoluted, or not convoluted, but hard to keep track of who was responsible for what, who did what, because there were so many different powers at play, I guess. I couldn't quite keep them straight in my head. So I think that could have been tightened up a little bit. Also, I think some of the action could have been trimmed. This might be more so a me thing because I'm a very visual person and I have to kind of see things happening. So action in books doesn't always work for me because I literally can't keep track of where people are, and I have to go back and reread because I don't really understand what's going on. This has been turned into a television series, so I might watch the first season, and if it works better for me in like television format, I might just continue with the series that way instead of continuing with the books. So yeah, for me, the action could have been trimmed because I couldn't follow it that well. And the only other thing that really bothered me was I found that all of the characters were a little bit too heroic. Either they were kind of like stone-faced or like super noble or whatever, but they were seeing some truly terrific things. And not all of them were detectives and military. Like, I would have expected some of them to be absolutely freaking out, and that just didn't really happen. And so it was hard to suspend my disbelief entirely in that way. But yeah, overall, I thought it was engaging. I liked it. Remains to be seen whether I will continue with the series or just like watch the TV show. So the next book I read on audio, and that was Rebecca by Daphne du Maurier. I loved this. I gave it 5 stars. I will definitely be picking up more du Maurier. So Rebecca is about a young woman, the protagonist, who remains nameless throughout the book, and she has married a man who has recently lost his wife, and his deceased wife is the titular Rebecca. And our protagonist is haunted metaphorically by Rebecca's presence. It's a gothic novel. It's very thrilling in parts, very slow and moody in other parts, and it involves a lot of twists and turns in the second half especially. I loved how beautifully all of the different themes were tied together in this book. So some of the things that this book really comments on very subtly are gender roles and like power dynamics, especially in relation to gender. And kind of along the same lines, it talks a lot about identity and how we affirm our own identity versus letting others place an identity upon us or place a role upon us. So like going back to like gender roles, especially how women in this book are placed into roles. There is a lot in this book about jealousy, and this is also tied back to the identity portion of it. The narrator, the protagonist that we follow, she isn't really able to disentangle herself from Rebecca. The protagonist feels like a usurper. She feels jealous of Rebecca even though Rebecca is dead. She feels jealous of Rebecca's like metaphorical presence in the house. And so then the protagonist isn't really able to form her own identity outside of that, outside of being Mrs. De Winter. But she feels that Rebecca hasn't really relinquished the title of Mrs. De Winter, even though she's dead. It's all very interesting. I just loved it. I also really liked the feeling of imprisonment in this book, being trapped like physically in this house with really like no one to talk to or anything to do. But also like mentally trapped and not being able to disentangle from Rebecca. I thought those kind of like feelings of imprisonment were very interesting. I like how the book kept on going in different directions that you can't really foresee. There was a fairly big twist in the second half. Twist, like a reveal, I guess, that I had predicted, and I'm not very good at predicting things, so I was quite pleased with myself, thinking that I had figured it out before the book revealed it. And then the book takes like a million 180s from there. So I really only figured out the first thing, which I don't think was actually that much of a secret. So yeah, here I was feeling all pleased with myself that I figured out this reveal. And then every chapter thereafter was just like another thing thrown at you. I love the atmosphere, like that gothic, eerie atmosphere with this like slow building tension. It was very unsettling. I love that kind of feeling in a book. This was a brilliant book and I loved it. So the last book I have to tell you about is a nonfiction called I'm Afraid of Men by Vivek Shraya. Vivek Shraya is a trans woman, and this book is a short memoir kind of, or like social commentary through the lens of a trans woman. I also listened to this on audiobook. So in this book, Shraya tells us why she's afraid of men, both because of her life as a woman, but also previous to her transition when she was living as a gay man, why she was afraid of men in that context as well. I think it was overall well done. I really did like how Shraya talks about like toxic masculinity and misogyny, and how those things show up as a queer man and as a woman, and how it shows up in a multitude of different ways. As a woman, I've seen many of these things, but she has such a unique perspective that there were a lot of things I hadn't really considered, or she put them in a different framework or in a different way that I hadn't seen it from that angle before. So I thought that was very interesting for me to kind of look at those issues of misogyny and toxic masculinity from all of these different angles. I thought was just a real service to the book. I especially loved her commentary on a section of the book of a good man, and how that label is not very helpful, and that the standards we hold men to who get the label of good man are quite low, and that just like basic decency puts men on a pedestal. And near the end, she also dives into why she is scared of many women and how cis women uphold misogyny. And that section I thought was also very interesting. So I really liked in this book that unique perspective of someone who grew up labeled a boy and who was conditioned under those social constructs, who now has the perspective of being a woman, and how toxic masculinity played a role in both those identities for her. Something I really liked about this book is it offers a lot of space for reflection, for self-reflection. She poses some questions and she invites you to consider your own unconscious biases. So there was a lot of room for kind of like mulling over these things. The thing I disliked about this is I did think it was too short. I think this audiobook was like an hour and a half or something like that. I think the physical format is like 90 something pages. And I think a lot of the issues she brings up could be really delved into with a lot more depth. And I realized that, I mean, she could have taken any one piece of the things she was talking about and created a whole other book. And I'm not saying this had to be like a 2,000 page book, but because I really valued her unique perspective, I would have liked a little bit more on at least a few of those topics she was talking about, because I think it did kind of skim and give an overall picture. And it was a good overall picture, but I just would have liked a little bit more from her in some of the bigger points of the book, I guess. But overall, would recommend. So those were the books I read in June. If you've read any of these and want to have a chat about them in the comments below, please leave me a comment. I would love to have a chat with you. As always, I hope you're doing well, and we'll chat soon. Take care. Bye.